The gunshot cracked through Rattlesnake Ridge just as Molly Walsh bent to fill her water bucket at the creek. And in 1861 Utah Territory during a heat wave that turned the whole world to dust and desperation. Gunshots meant somebody's luck had run out. She looked up and saw the man stumbling toward her through the willows, blood seeping between his fingers where he clutched his shoulder. And she knew three things instantly. First, he was too well dressed to be a drifter. Second, he was losing blood fast enough to die if she didn't help. Third, whoever shot him would be coming to finish the job.
I need your help.
His voice came out rough and steady, despite the pain etched across his face.
Name's Josiah Hawkins, and I own the H-Bar H, spread up the ridge. And the man who shot me wants me dead before I can tell anyone what I saw.
What you saw where?
Molly kept her voice calm, even as her mind raced through options. Because school teachers learned early how to think fast when chaos erupted.
Basil Lockhart's warehouse.
The name hit her like cold water, because everyone in Rattlesnake Ridge knew Lockhart, the gunsmith who sold ammunition to every ranch and stage line within 50 miles. And she'd always thought there was something wrong about the way he smiled.
The warehouse that burned last month?
Didn't burn by accident.
Josiah swayed, and she caught his elbow, steadying him as another gunshot cracked from the ridge above, and a bullet kicked up water 3 feet from where they stood.
Run.
She didn't wait for him to argue, just grabbed his good arm and hauled him downstream toward the old line shack she used for storage. And he matched her pace, even though every step jolted his shoulder and drew a hiss of pain through his teeth. They splashed through the creek, and she shoved him through the shack's sagging door, just as another bullet punched through the weathered planks 6 inches from her head.
Get down.
She dropped beside him on the dusty floor and yanked the door shut, then wedged a rusted shovel through the handle as a makeshift bar.
How bad is it?
Bad enough.
He pulled his hand away, and she saw the ragged tear in his shirt soaked dark with blood. And she knew he had maybe an hour before blood loss made him too weak to move.
I need to see it.
She didn't ask permission, just unbuttoned his vest with quick, efficient fingers and peeled back the torn fabric, and he watched her face instead of looking at the wound.
You're not squeamish.
I'm a school teacher.
She found the cleanest rag in the shack and pressed it against the bleeding hole, and he caught her wrist when she pressed too hard.
Easy.
Stop being a baby.
The corner of his mouth twitched, and she realized with a jolt that he was trying not to smile, and something warm uncurled in her chest that had nothing to do with the stifling heat. The sound of boots crunching gravel outside killed the moment cold. A man's voice called out rough and confident. The rider announced that Lockhart wanted Hawkins brought back alive if possible. And Molly felt Josiah's whole body go rigid beside her.
That's Fletcher.
He spoke barely above a whisper, his breath warm against her ear, because they'd pressed close together behind the water barrel.
Lockhart's enforcer. He'll burn this shack with us inside if we don't move now.
Back window.
She'd explored every inch of this property when she'd inherited it 6 months ago, after her uncle died. And she knew the rotted boards on the back wall would pull free with one good kick.
You first.
Together.
She met his eyes and saw the stubborn set of his jaw that said he'd argue all day if she let him. So she kissed him instead, fast and hard and desperate, just long enough to shock him into silence.
That's for luck. Now move.
They hit the back wall together, and the boards splintered outward with a crack that sounded like thunder. And they tumbled through into the blazing afternoon heat, just as Fletcher kicked in the front door.
train yard.
Josiah grabbed her hand, and they ran, boots pounding dust, toward the distant clang of the freight train that was just starting to pull out of Rattlesnake Ridge's single-platform station.
We'll never make it.
We don't have a choice.
A bullet whined past her ear, and she felt the heat of it against her cheek. And she ran harder, her lungs burning in the scorching air as the train's whistle screamed and black smoke belched from the stack. The freight cars were already rolling, picking up speed with each revolution of the massive wheels. And she knew if they missed this train, they'd be dead before sunset.
Grab the ladder.
He pointed at the iron rungs bolted to the freight car's side, and she saw their chance narrowing with every second. So she lunged forward and caught the bottom rung with both hands, and the sudden jerk nearly ripped her arms from their sockets. Her boots dragged in the gravel, and she screamed, not from fear, but from pure rage at the thought of dying before she'd figured out what Lockhart was hiding. And then Josiah's hand closed around her waist and shoved her upward with desperate strength. She scrambled onto the ladder and looked down to see him running beside the train with blood soaking his entire left side. And she knew he didn't have the strength left to pull himself up.
Give me your hand.
She lay flat on her stomach on the freight car's roof and reached down, stretching until her shoulder joint screamed, and he jumped and caught her wrist, and she hauled backward with everything she had. For one terrible second she thought they'd both fall, and then he hooked his boot on the bottom rung and pulled himself up beside her, and they collapsed together on the sun-scorched metal roof, gasping for breath, while the train carried them away from Fletcher's bullets.
You're stronger than you look.
You're heavier than you look.
He laughed, and then groaned because laughing hurt his shoulder. And she found herself laughing too, giddy with adrenaline and relief, and the wild impossibility of still being alive. The train rocked beneath them as it picked up speed, and she realized her hand was still gripping his vest, and his arm was still around her waist, and neither of them seemed inclined to move.
About that kiss.
That was just for luck.
Did it work?
We're alive. Aren't we?
She met his eyes and saw heat there that had nothing to do with the brutal sun, and she knew she should pull away, but she couldn't quite make herself let go. The train whistle shrieked again and jolted them back to reality, and she sat up and looked around at the endless Scrubland rolling past.
Where is this train going?
Silver Springs Junction.
He pushed himself up with a wince, and she saw fresh blood seeping through the makeshift bandage.
We can get horses there and cut through Whispering Canyon back to your ranch.
My ranch?
You own the old Walsh spread, don't you? The schoolhouse property by the creek.
How did you know?
Everyone knows Molly Walsh, the teacher who inherited a ranch and refuses to sell no matter how many offers Lockhart makes.
The pieces clicked together in her mind like a lock opening, and she felt cold despite the heat.
He wants my land.
He wants everyone's land between here and the new railroad spur.
Josiah shifted to sit beside her, their shoulders touching for balance as the train swayed.
I saw him in that warehouse the night before it burned.
He paused, and she saw the muscle in his jaw tighten.
He was loading crates into a wagon, and when he saw me, he pulled his gun. I got away, but he sent Fletcher after me, and I've been running ever since.
What was in the crates?
Ammunition.
He met her eyes, and she saw the anger there, mixed with something that looked like shame.
Bad ammunition. Shells that explode in the chamber. Bullets that shatter. He's been selling it to every ranch in the territory, waiting for accidents to happen so he can buy the land cheap when the owners can't work it anymore.
My uncle.
The words came out flat and hard.
He died when his rifle misfired during the spring roundup. Everyone said it was bad luck.
It wasn't luck.
He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, needing the solid warmth of his grip to anchor her against the wave of fury that threatened to drown her.
I'm sorry.
Don't be sorry. Help me stop him.
The train began to slow as it approached Silver Springs, and she saw the small cluster of buildings that marked the junction settlement ahead.
We need horses, and we need them fast.
He stood and offered her his hand, pulling her to her feet as the train's brakes screeched.
Fletcher will telegraph ahead. We have maybe 20 minutes before Lockhart's men cut us off.
They climbed down the ladder as the train rolled into the station, and she jumped to the platform before it had fully stopped, landing in a crouch that sent up a puff of dust. Josiah landed beside her with less grace, stumbling as his injured shoulder threw off his balance, and she caught him before he could fall.
Easy.
She steadied him with both hands on his chest and felt his heart hammering beneath her palms. And for a moment they stood frozen in a bubble of intimacy, while chaos swirled around them.
I'm fine.
You're bleeding.
I'll bleed later. Right now, we need horses.
He was right, but she hated it. Hated the way he pushed through pain like it was nothing. Hated the casual way he accepted that he might die before nightfall. The livery stable was 2 buildings down from the station, and they ran for it while curious faces watched from doorways and windows. The stable master was an old man with suspicious eyes, who looked them over and named a price that would have bought a good horse in any normal circumstance.
Highway robbery.
The old man shrugged and tapped his snakehead cane against the stable post, and Molly felt ice slide down her spine, because she knew that cane.
You work for Lockhart.
The old man's face went carefully blank, and that was answer enough.
We're taking the horses.
Josiah's hand dropped to his gun, but Molly was faster, grabbing a pitchfork from the wall and driving it into the ground between the old man's boots hard enough to make him jump back.
The gray mare and the bay gelding. Saddle them now.
The old man looked at the pitchfork still quivering in the dirt and decided cooperation was his best option. 5 minutes later, they were mounted and riding hard toward Whispering Canyon, and Molly heard the old man shouting behind them, but the words were lost in the thunder of hoofbeats. The canyon entrance yawned before them like a mouth, ready to swallow them whole, and Molly felt the temperature drop 10 degrees as they rode into the shadow of the towering red rock walls.
Stay close.
Josiah's voice echoed off the stone, and she urged her mare forward until they were riding knee to knee, close enough that she could see the tight line of pain around his mouth, and the way he held his injured arm rigid against his side. The canyon floor was treacherous with loose rock and hidden gullies, and she had to focus all her attention on guiding her horse through the maze, while the walls pressed in on either side. Then she heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats coming fast from behind, and she knew Fletcher had caught up to them.
How many?
She twisted in her saddle and counted silhouettes against the canyon entrance's bright opening.
4 riders.
We can't outrun them.
He scanned the canyon walls with desperate intensity.
We have to take the devil's jump.
That's suicide.
So is getting caught.
He pointed at a narrow crack in the canyon wall ahead, where a tiny trail switchbacked up the cliff face, barely wide enough for a single horse. And she saw where it led. A natural stone bridge spanning a 50-foot gap between 2 cliff faces, weathered smooth by centuries of wind and rain, no wider than a wagon bed.
If we fall, we die.
If we stay, we die. Pick your poison.
She looked back at Fletcher's riders gaining ground and made her choice.
You go first.
Like hell.
You're injured, and you need someone behind you in case you fall.
He opened his mouth to argue, but she kicked her mare forward onto the trail before he could stop her. And she heard him curse and follow. The trail was worse than she'd imagined. Crumbling rock that shifted under her horse's hooves, and she had to lean forward over the mare's neck and murmur constant encouragement as they climbed. Below them, the canyon floor dropped away until it was just a thin ribbon of shadow. And she made the mistake of looking down once before forcing her eyes back to the trail.
Don't stop.
His voice came from behind her, steady and calm, and she used it as an anchor to keep moving when every instinct screamed at her to freeze. The stone bridge appeared suddenly as they crested the switchback, and it was even narrower than it had looked from below. Barely wide enough for her mare's hooves, with nothing but air on either side.
Easy, girl.
She kept her voice soft and steady as she guided the mare onto the bridge, feeling the animal's muscles bunch with fear beneath her. Every step felt like it might be their last, and she could hear loose pebbles skittering off the edge and falling into nothing, the sound taking forever to reach bottom. Halfway across, she heard Josiah's horse whinny in fear, and she looked back to see the gelding's rear hoof slip over the edge.
Josiah.
Keep going.
His voice was tight with strain as he fought to keep the gelding steady, and she saw blood dripping from his injured shoulder where the effort had reopened the wound. The gelding recovered its footing, and they kept moving, and she didn't breathe again until she felt solid ground under her mare's hooves on the far side. She dismounted and turned to help him down, and he practically fell into her arms, his face gray with pain and blood loss.
We need to stop that bleeding.
Not here.
He pushed away from her and remounted with visible effort.
Fletcher, we'll find another way across. We need to reach your ranch before dark.
They rode hard through the Badlands as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that would have been beautiful if she'd had time to notice. Her ranch appeared as they crested the final ridge, the small timber house and barn looking fragile and alone in the vast empty landscape. And she felt a surge of fierce protective love for this land that her uncle had worked, until it killed him.
Someone's there.
Josiah's hand went to his gun as he pointed at the thin column of smoke rising from her chimney, and she felt her stomach drop because she'd left the house locked and empty this morning. They approached carefully, dismounting 100 yards out and moving forward on foot through the lengthening shadows. The front door stood open and she could hear voices inside, and she recognized one of them.
Lockhart.
She started to stand, but Josiah pulled her back down with his good arm wrapped around her waist, his mouth close to her ear.
Wait.
His breath was warm against her neck, and she became acutely aware of how they were pressed together, his chest against her back, his heart beating steady and strong where she could feel it.
We need to know what he's doing here.
He was right, but it took all her self-control to stay hidden when every instinct screamed at her to storm inside and throw Lockhart out of her house. They crept closer, and she heard Lockhart's voice clearly now, smooth and confident, as he spoke to someone inside. The gunsmith was telling Fletcher to search the property thoroughly, that the ring had to be somewhere on the Walsh land, and if they found it before Hawkins and the girl did then, there'd be nothing to tie him to the warehouse fire or the bad ammunition.
What ring?
She whispered it so quietly the words were barely sound, but Josiah heard, and his arm tightened around her.
I don't know.
But she did know, suddenly and with absolute certainty, because she'd found something in the creek this morning, before the shooting started. She'd been washing her breakfast dishes when the sun caught something shining in the shallow water, and she'd reached down and pulled out a gold wedding ring with an inscription inside. She'd slipped it into her pocket, meaning to ask around town if anyone had lost it. And then Josiah had stumbled into her life bleeding and desperate, and she'd forgotten all about it. Now she understood. The ring was evidence, proof of something that could destroy Lockhart. And he knew she had it, even if she didn't know what it meant.
I found it.
She breathed the words and felt Josiah go very still.
This morning. In the creek. It's in my pocket.
Let me see it.
She fished it out and held it up in the fading light, and they both saw the inscription at the same time. The engraving read, "To Samuel Walsh, 1859, and Molly felt the world tilt, because Samuel Walsh was her uncle, and she'd never known he'd been married.
Your uncle's wedding ring.
He never mentioned a wife.
Maybe she's why he died.
The pieces were coming together now, fast and terrible. If her uncle had evidence against Lockhart and had been killed for it, if his wife had the ring and had dropped it or thrown it in the creek before she disappeared, then finding that ring meant Molly could prove Lockhart was a murderer. Inside the house, Lockhart's voice rose in anger, and she heard the distinctive sound of his snakehead cane tapping against the wooden floor, sharp and rhythmic, the sound of a man losing patience. The gunsmith announced he was done waiting, that they'd burn the house and the barn and the whole property, if they had to, and Fletcher should start with the outbuildings.
We have to move now.
Josiah pulled her to her feet, and they ran for the barn, staying low and using the corral fence for cover. They made it inside just as Fletcher emerged from the house carrying a burning brand, and Molly felt rage boil up inside her hot enough to match the flames.
I'm going to kill him.
Get in line.
She looked at him and saw her own fury reflected in his eyes, and she knew they were thinking the same thing. They'd lost too much to these men already, and they weren't losing anything more. The barn was full of tools and equipment and bales of hay that would burn like tinder if Fletcher got close enough, and she grabbed a coil of rope while Josiah picked up a pitchfork and tested its weight. They positioned themselves on either side of the barn door and waited, listening to Fletcher's boots crunch on the gravel outside. The door swung open, and Fletcher stepped inside holding the burning brand high, and Molly swung the rope in a wide arc that caught him across the knees and sent him sprawling. The brand flew from his hand and landed in a patch of dirt, sputtering harmlessly, and Josiah was on him before he could draw his gun. The pitchfork came down point first into the dirt beside Fletcher's head, and the man froze.
Give me one reason not to finish this.
Fletcher's eyes went wide, and he started babbling about how Lockhart had forced him, how he'd just been following orders, and Molly kicked his gun away before he could get clever.
Where's the evidence? The documents my uncle had?
Fletcher swore he didn't know, said Lockhart kept everything locked up tight. And then, Lockhart's voice cut through the night from outside. The gunsmith was shouting for Fletcher, demanding to know what was taking so long, and Molly heard that cane tapping again as he walked toward the barn.
Hide.
Josiah hauled Fletcher up and shoved him toward the back of the barn, then pulled Molly into the shadows behind a stack of hay bales. They crouched there shoulder to shoulder, breathing hard, and she could feel the heat of him against her side and smell the salt sweat and dust on his skin. Lockhart entered the barn calling Fletcher's name, his cane clicking on the packed earth floor, and Molly held her breath. The gunsmith walked past their hiding spot so close she could have reached out and touched him. and she felt Josiah's hand settle warm and steady on her waist, anchoring her in place. Lockhart found Fletcher tied up in the back and let out a roar of fury. And that's when Josiah moved. He burst from cover with Molly right behind him, and they sprinted for the door. But Lockhart spun faster than she expected, and his cane came up like a weapon. The snakehead handle caught Josiah across the ribs, and he went down hard. And Molly screamed and threw herself between them.
You want me? Here I am.
Lockhart smiled, and it was the coldest thing she'd ever seen. He told her she'd made this so much harder than it needed to be, that he'd offered her uncle a fair price for the land, and the old fool had refused, had threatened to expose Lockhart's business practices to the territorial governor. So he'd killed him, made it look like an accident, and when the wife had found the documents proving the fires were arson for profit, she'd run. Lockhart had tracked her to the creek, and she'd thrown the ring in the water before he'd caught her, and Molly felt sick understanding what that meant.
You murdered them both.
Lockhart shrugged and said it was just business, that she could make this easy by signing over the deed and leaving town tonight. Or she could make it hard and end up in the creek with her uncle and his wife. Behind her, Josiah was getting to his feet, moving slow and careful. And Molly kept talking to hold Lockhart's attention.
The ring proves everything. I already sent a telegram to the territorial marshal.
It was a lie, but a good one, and she saw doubt flicker in Lockhart's eyes. He shifted his weight, and his cane tapped once against the floor. And then Josiah hit him from behind like a charging bull. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs and fury, and Molly grabbed the nearest weapon she could find, which turned out to be a bucket of water left for the horses. She threw it, and the cold water doused them both, and in the shock of it, Josiah landed a punch that sent Lockhart sprawling. The snakehead cane skittered across the floor, and Molly snatched it up, holding it like a club. Lockhart was done. He stayed down, gasping and beaten, and Molly heard hoofbeats approaching fast from the road. The real sheriff arrived with 2 deputies, drawn by the gunfire and smoke. And Molly handed over the ring and told the whole story, while Josiah leaned against the barn wall, catching his breath. The sheriff took one look at Lockhart and started laughing, said the territorial marshal had been building a case against him for months, and this was the missing piece. Lockhart and Fletcher were arrested on the spot, dragged out to the waiting horses while Lockhart cursed and threatened. And then the night went quiet, except for the wind and the distant call of a coyote. Molly stood in the barn doorway and felt the adrenaline drain out of her all at once, leaving her shaky and exhausted. Josiah came up beside her and put a hand on her shoulder, and she leaned into him without thinking.
You did good.
We did good.
He smiled, and it was the first real smile she'd seen from him, warm and genuine, and it made him look younger and less haunted. They walked back to the house together, and she made coffee while he washed the blood off his face. And they sat at her kitchen table in the lamplight, while the heat wave pressed down outside. The night was still sweltering, and the boards creaked in the heat, but Molly didn't mind anymore.
What happens now?
I stay and help you run this place, if you'll have me.
Just until spring roundup?
Longer, if you want.
She looked at him across the table and saw the hope in his eyes, fragile and new. And she thought about the wedding ring in her pocket and the way he'd stood between her and danger without hesitation.
I want longer.
He reached across the table and took her hand, his grip rough and warm, and they sat like that until the coffee went cold. Over the next few days, they worked side by side repairing what Lockhart's men had damaged, and Molly learned that Josiah was good with his hands, and better with horses, and terrible at cooking. She taught him how to make biscuits that didn't turn out like rocks, and he taught her how to rope a steer without getting trampled. And somewhere in the middle of all that hard work, they fell into an easy rhythm that felt like home. One morning she woke before dawn and found him already outside feeding the horses, and she stood on the porch watching him move through the chores with quiet competence. He looked up and caught her staring, and she felt her cheeks go hot, but he just grinned and motioned her over.
Come help me with this mare. She's favoring her left front hoof.
Molly went down to the corral and held the mare's halter while Josiah examined the hoof, his hands gentle and sure, and the mare settled under his touch. He found a stone wedged in the frog and worked it free, then set the hoof down carefully.
There. Good as new.
The mare nuzzled his shoulder, and he laughed, low and pleased, and Molly felt something shift in her chest. She'd been so focused on surviving, on keeping the ranch running, and staying one step ahead of disaster, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to just be happy. But watching Josiah with the horses, seeing the care he took with everything he touched, she felt happiness bubbling up inside her, bright and unexpected.
Josiah,
Yeah?
thank you for staying.
He turned to look at her, and the early sun caught in his eyes, turning them the color of summer sky, and she saw her own feelings reflected there.
Molly, I'm not going anywhere.
She believed him. They walked back to the house together and had breakfast on the porch, watching the heat waves rise off the land as the sun climbed higher. It was going to be another scorching day, but Molly didn't mind, because for the first time since her uncle died, she felt like she had a partner. Someone who wouldn't run when things got hard. After breakfast, Josiah announced they needed to check the water situation in the north pasture, said the heat wave might have dried up some of the smaller streams, and Molly agreed. They saddled 2 horses and rode out across the property, following the fence line north toward the canyon country. The land was harsh and beautiful, all red rock and scrub brush and endless sky, and Molly loved every stubborn inch of it. They found the stream running low but not dry, and Josiah suggested they could dam up a section to create a deeper pool for the cattle.
That's smart.
I worked a ranch in Colorado where we did the same thing. Saved our herd during a drought.
They spent the afternoon hauling rocks and building a crude dam, and by the time the sun started its descent toward the western hills, they were both filthy and exhausted. Molly's dress was soaked through with sweat, and her hair had come completely loose from its bun. And when she looked at Josiah, she started laughing, because he had mud smeared across his forehead.
You look like you lost a fight with the creek.
You look like you won one.
He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek, and the laughter died in her throat. They stood there in the shallows of the creek, with the water running cold over their boots and the heat pressing down from above, and Molly felt the air go electric between them. Josiah's hand slid down to cup her jaw, and she leaned into his touch. And when he kissed her, it felt like coming home after a long, hard journey. The kiss was gentle at first, testing and careful, and then it deepened, and Molly wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with everything she had. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, and Josiah rested his forehead against hers.
I've wanted to do that since the first time you pointed that shotgun at me.
You're insane.
About you. Yeah.
She laughed and kissed him again, and this time, when they pulled apart, she didn't let go. They stood in the creek, holding each other, while the sun painted the canyon walls gold and red. And Molly knew with absolute certainty that this was where she was meant to be. They rode back to the ranch, as the stars came out, their horses walking side by side, and Josiah reached over and took her hand. That night, they sat on the porch steps and talked until the moon was high, sharing stories about their lives before they met. Josiah told her about growing up on a ranch in Colorado, about losing his family to cholera, and drifting for years trying to find a place that felt right. Molly told him about her uncle, about how he'd taken her in when her parents died, and taught her everything he knew about running a ranch.
He would have liked you.
I wish I could have met him.
Me too.
The next morning brought news that made Molly's heart soar. The real estate office in town sent word that with Lockhart's arrest, all his fraudulent claims on properties were being reversed, and the territorial governor himself had written a letter praising Molly for her courage in exposing the corruption. More importantly, the spring roundup cattle drive was confirmed for the end of the week, and the buyers were offering top dollar because the heat wave had made beef scarce everywhere else. Molly and Josiah threw themselves into preparations, working dawn to dusk getting the herd ready and repairing equipment. They moved through the work like a well-oiled machine, anticipating each other's needs and covering each other's weaknesses. And every night, they sat together on the porch and watched the stars come out. 3 days before the cattle drive was scheduled to leave, Josiah asked her to take a ride with him up to Rattlesnake Ridge. They saddled the horses in the golden light of late afternoon and rode up the winding trail that climbed the spine of the ridge. And when they reached the top, Molly caught her breath. From here, she could see the whole property spread out below them, the house and barn and corrals looking small and neat, the pastures stretching away toward the distant mountains. The heat wave was finally breaking, and she could see storm clouds massing on the horizon, promising rain. Josiah dismounted and helped her down, his hands lingering on her waist, and they stood together looking out over the land.
This is it, isn't it? This is home.
It could be. For both of us.
He turned to face her and pulled something from his pocket, and Molly's breath caught when she saw what it was. Her uncle's wedding ring, the one she'd found in the creek, polished clean and shining in the fading light.
The sheriff gave this back after the trial, said it belonged to your family, and you should decide what to do with it.
Molly took the ring and turned it over in her hands, reading the inscription again. To Samuel Walsh, 1859. A promise made and kept until death. A love that had cost two people everything. She looked up at Josiah and saw the question in his eyes before he asked it.
Molly Walsh, will you marry me?
Her heart felt too big for her chest, and she was laughing and crying at the same time. And when she tried to answer him, the words came out shaky, but sure.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely yes.
He kissed her there on the ridge with the storm clouds rolling in and the wind picking up, and when they broke apart, he slipped the ring onto her finger. It was too big, but she didn't care. She'd wear it on a chain around her neck until they could get it resized, or get a new one made.
How soon?
How soon what?
How soon can we get married? I don't want to wait.
Neither do I.
They talked it through right there, standing on the ridge with the first drops of rain starting to fall. The cattle drive would leave in 3 days, and after it was done and the money was in hand, they'd have everything they needed to build a real future. The circuit preacher was due through town in a week, and that seemed like perfect timing.
A week from today.
A week from today.
They rode back down the ridge in the rain, letting it wash over them cool and clean after weeks of unrelenting heat. And by the time they reached the house, they were both soaked and laughing. Molly made hot coffee, while Josiah built a fire in the stove. And they sat together, wrapped in blankets, watching the storm through the window. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. The cattle drive crew arrived, and Josiah worked with them to get the herd ready, while Molly handled the paperwork and negotiations. She proved to be a fierce bargainer and got an even better price than they'd hoped for. And when the herd finally moved out heading for the railhead in Salt Lake City, she stood with Josiah watching them go.
That's our future, walking away on 4 legs.
That's our future, coming back with money in hand.
He was right. The drive would take 2 weeks there and back. And when it returned, they'd have enough capital to buy breeding stock and supplies, and maybe even hire a couple of hands to help with the work. Molly spent the waiting time preparing for the wedding, which mostly meant cleaning the house from top to bottom and trying to figure out what to wear. She had exactly 2 dresses, both practical cotton work dresses, and neither seemed right for a wedding. The problem solved itself when the general store owner's wife stopped by with a package. Inside was a beautiful cream-colored dress with lace at the collar and cuffs, and a note that said the women of the town wanted to thank her for bringing Lockhart to justice. Molly cried when she read it, overwhelmed by the kindness, and when she tried the dress on, it fit perfectly. Josiah saw her in it the day before the wedding, and his face went soft with wonder.
You're beautiful.
You're not supposed to see the dress before the wedding.
Too late now.
He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, careful not to crush the delicate fabric, and kissed her until she forgot why she'd been worried. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the heat wave long gone and the air fresh from recent rains. Molly woke early and found Josiah already outside, wearing new clothes he'd bought in town, a white shirt and dark vest, and trousers that made him look like a different man. Handsome and clean and ready for a new beginning. The ceremony was held on the ridge where he'd proposed, with the circuit preacher officiating and half the town in attendance. Molly wore the cream dress and carried wildflowers, and when she walked up the trail to where Josiah waited, she felt like she was walking into her real life, the one she was meant to live. The preacher kept it short and simple, asking them to repeat the traditional vows, and when Josiah slid the new ring onto her finger, a simple gold band they'd had made in town, Molly felt the last piece of her broken heart click into place.
I promise to stand with you, work beside you, and love you every day we have.
I promise the same. From this day forward.
The preacher pronounced them married, and Josiah kissed her while the crowd cheered, and Molly kissed him back with joy bubbling up inside her like spring water. They walked back down the ridge hand in hand as husband and wife, and the celebration that followed lasted well into the night. There was food and music and dancing, and Molly danced with Josiah under the stars while the fiddles played, and the heat of summer finally gave way to the promise of autumn. Later, when the guests had gone home and the ranch was quiet again, Molly and Josiah sat on the porch steps, just like they had so many nights before. But tonight was different. Tonight they were married, partners in every way, and the future stretched out before them, full of possibility.
No regrets?
Not a single one.
Good. Because you're stuck with me now.
Best decision I ever made.
He laughed and pulled her close, and she settled against his side with her head on his shoulder. The night was warm, but not oppressive, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and rain-washed earth. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called, and another answered, and Molly felt at peace for the first time in longer than she could remember.
What are you thinking about?
Everything. How close we came to losing this. How lucky we are.
Luck had nothing to do with it. You fought for this place. You earned it.
We earned it. Together.
He kissed the top of her head, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. The cattle drive would return in 10 days with the money they needed, and then the real work would begin. But Molly wasn't worried. She had a partner now, a husband who would stand beside her through whatever came next. They had land and cattle and a future worth fighting for, and most importantly, they had each other. The moon rose full and bright, painting the land silver, and Molly thought about the journey that had brought them here. From the moment Josiah had stumbled into her yard bleeding, and desperate to this perfect night under the stars. It had been a wild ride full of danger and fear and unexpected joy. She'd never imagined when she woke up that morning weeks ago and found a ring in the creek that it would lead to this, to a husband and a partnership and a love that felt solid and true.
Josiah?
Yeah?
I love you.
I love you too. More than I thought I could love anything.
They sat on the ridge until the moon reached its peak and started its descent. And then they walked back down to the house together, to their home, to the life they would build side by side. And as they crossed the threshold, Molly looked back one last time at the land spread out under the stars, at Rattlesnake Ridge rising dark against the sky, and she smiled. This was home. This was family. This was everything she'd ever wanted, earned through fire and danger and determination, and she would protect it with everything she had. But she wouldn't be protecting it alone anymore. She had Josiah now, and together they could face anything the territory threw at them. The door closed behind them, and the night settled quiet over the ranch, peaceful and full of promise. And somewhere in the darkness, a coyote sang a lonesome song that sounded like contentment.